In this lesson, I'm going to explain how to use materials presets. I'm also going to show you how to download a full set of materials presets from Adobe for free. So to follow along, go to Photoshop and open that up. Let's make a new document, File New, this one here. And let's make a sphere. So go to the 3D panel, Mesh from Preset, Sphere, Create. There we go. This is the standard starting point for this sphere. I'll click on it once to select the sphere, one more time to select the material. Let's take a look here. Diffuse has a texture map associated with it. You can tell by that little icon inside the folder there, but nothing else has a texture map associated with it. Then you see the settings here. The bump is set to 10%. It doesn't make a difference because there's no bump map. Everything else is kind of default here. 20% means that's a pretty large specular highlight. We can change that, make it smaller like that, or even larger. There you go. But the texture map might be interesting, so let's open that up and take a look at it. Turns out it's just an empty layer. Where there's nothing, you end up with that kind of gray look that you've seen on many of these meshes. All right, let's replace that by applying a materials preset. So go over here to that little drop-down group, and here are the presets that come with Photoshop. Let's just take a look at one of them. Let's take a look at this green one. Click on that, Organics Moss. What do we have here? Let's close it down and take a look. We have two things. We've got a diffuse texture map and a bump texture map. Let's take a look at the diffuse texture map. If I hover here, eventually you'll see that little file. It shows up there as this thumbnail. I can click on this, open up Edit Texture, and you'll see it as well. Just some green and yellow dots. That's what gives it its appearance, its color. Close that down. That's diffuse. And down here we have a bump map. I'll hover over that as well. You see that it's just a bunch of black dots or gray dots. Gives it its texture. Let me just open that up anyways. Wherever you see black, it goes into the object. Wherever you see white, it comes out. And gray is kind of neutral. I'll close that down. So that's what defines that rough appearance there. I can pull the bump map down a bit and kind of smooth it off a bit like that. And pull it in a little bit like so. Okay, that's that little preset. Let's go up here and try a different one. This one's kind of interesting. Let's click on that one. What's going on there? There's no diffuse texture map. It's just red. But we have two things down here. We have a shine texture map, which is a little unusual. And then we have a bump texture map. Let's take a look at the bump first. If I increase the bump, let's see what happens. It gets more dramatic in terms of the depth of those holes there. Go all the way to the left. It's kind of flat. Pull it in a bit. So what would the bump texture map look like? Let's open it up. Edit the texture. It says there's more than one place where this thing's used. That's because it's used with the shine as well. I'll click OK. And that's the texture map. Wherever it's black, it goes in. Wherever it's gray, it's neutral. And wherever it's white, it would come out. Well, there's no white here. It's just gray where it's neutral and black going in. All right. Let's close that down. That's what defines those little holes there that go partway into the skin. The shine uses the same texture map. I'll go over here and take a look at it. I'll edit it, and we'll get the same message saying it's in more than one place. Click OK. So wherever you see black, that shows shine at basically 0%. That means the full object would be illuminated. The specular highlight would fill the entire object. Where it's gray, it basically shows it in the sort of default setting of around 80%, something like that. So I'll close this down. We'll take a look at what I mean. See a little specular highlight there right in the middle? Normally, if I were to take this to the left and drop it down to towards 0, that thing would grow, but it's not growing here because there is this texture map that defines it. So everything down there where the holes are, that's how it would look if there was no texture map, if I was down to 0%. Over here at about 80% or so, this is how the darker red would look. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to remove the texture. And you see there is the highlight. If I go to 0, you'll see the pink color that we saw earlier inside all of the holes. So by applying the texture map, it defines the shine. It doesn't need to use this little slider. Alrighty, let's go down and take a look at one more. Let's take a look at this one here because it has holes in it. It has opacity issues. Click on that. Now what's going on there? You see the color is just red, no texture map. We have two things. We have a bump map and an opacity map. Let's take a look at the opacity map because it defines those holes. I'll hover over here. You can see it. Just a bunch of black dots. Let's take a look at it. Those black dots define those holes. Every dot is a hole. The rest of the white areas are opaque. So I'll close this down. Those holes are defined by that opacity texture map. The bump is a little more subtle, but there's a texture map for the bump as well. Let's take a look at that. Edit the texture. It looks neutral gray, so you wonder why there's any texture at all, but in fact it's not really neutral gray. It started off down here as layer 1 there. You see it's got add noise and clouds. You've got this kind of busy thing. But the levels here is set that there's very little contrast. I'll turn it off for a second. You see, oh, that's what it started like. And now you apply levels and it kind of smooths it out. I'm going to increase the contrast a bit here. And now I'm going to click this little X and say, yep, we'll save this. You'll see that the bump map will then change and the texture will change here on the outside of that thing. We can increase it like this and make it really extreme. So that's how those basic presets work. But there are more that you can load up straight out of Photoshop. I'll click this little drop down list here. There's this guy here. I click on that. And it says default for ray tracer. What the heck is that? Let's click on that. We'll append the group. We'll add the ray tracer presets to the group. And now there are 12 more. Scroll down here. What's different about this group? Well, this group has transparency or reflectivity. When you have transparency or reflectivity, you need to render it to really see it at work. Let's go down here and click on one of these guys. It's pretty straightforward. I'll click on that. Let's close this down. What's going on here? It's very simple. Just a color. Shine is made to be a little bit fatter than normal. That's all that is. But there's just a little bit of reflection. And so to see this really properly, you need to render it. So I'll click on the render button here, and it'll change slightly. It won't be really that obvious. It's more obvious when you deal with transparency, but you see it gets a little bit more like, well, perhaps gold shining off there, like a gold orb or something. I'll stop the rendering now just by clicking anywhere. Let's change this to something else. Click this drop-down group here and go to transparency like this one. Click on that, glass crystal, and it's gone. We have nothing behind it, so it's hard to see it. I'll click over here to close that down. What's going on here? We see that the color is white. We see that the reflection is set to 24%, but there's nothing to reflect off of at the moment. The shine is 98%, meaning that the little specular highlight is tiny here. But there's opacity down to 1%, meaning it's basically transparent. That's all this is. It's just a white thing that's transparent. To see it, I need to do a little bit of rendering. I won't see much, though, right? Where is the darn thing? Oh, no, it's gone. Well, to see it, let's add some color to it. So I'll stop this, change the color to something else, just to give it a little bit of color so you can sort of see the thing. We'll try to render it again here. It'll still be basically nothing because the opacity is set to 1%. So let's change the opacity to something a little bit more than 1%. Now you begin to see it. We'll render it again. There you go. And I'll stop it now. We could make it a little prettier, but I'm going to stop the rendering now. So why have something that's transparent and invisible? That's because you can reflect things off it, and that'll look pretty cool when you do reflect objects off it. But that's typical for that ray tracer group. You need to render them to really see how they work. And then when you're done with your projects, you render them in full. Right here, we're just kind of doing a preliminary render. All right, but we're not done. With those 24 loaded up, there are many, many more that you can load up, and you need to first find them. So you get them by going to 3D, and then going down to the bottom here, Get More Content. That takes you to an Adobe website, Photoshop Extended website. Scroll down a bit here. There are several things that you can download: stages and sets, models, versatile materials, and image-based lights. The models and meshes are mainly for purchase, but these guys here are free, and we'll talk about these guys later. But let's take a look at the materials here. Click on that. It opens up this little box here. Click on this that downloads the materials. It asks you to open them rather than save them. It opens them with the Adobe Extension Manager, which is a pretty cool thing. It just takes these guys, this ZXP file, and then loads it in the proper place and loads it up in the program. So I click OK there. And it fires up Adobe Extension Manager. We get this little disclaimer, yeah, accept the license, of course. And then it says, I'm about to replace the ones that I've already loaded up. We don't need to see that process. I'm sure you can figure that out. So I'm going to click No here. But once you do load these guys up, they show up inside Photoshop. I'm going to close down the browser. Let's take a look at that. Go back to this group of presets here. Go down here again and look at these guys down here. These are all the ones that were loaded up from that group. We can pick any one of these, but I'm going to click on Fun here like that. We'll append the group with a Fun group. Let's scroll down here and see what we got. Whoa, look at all that stuff. All that stuff was just added. Holy cow. Let's start off with this one here. Whoa, look at that. Click on that. Actually has transparency in it like that. It's beautiful. Looks like a butterfly. Isn't that amazing? If we take a look at its materials here, click on the material there. You see that there's a texture map here. Hover over it, you see what it looks like. Obviously, it's a butterfly. You see there's an opacity map to define those holes there. Let's take a look at that one. You see that white is where the wings are. So that's how that one works. Let's take a look at another one here. Scrolling down a little farther. So there's lots of opacity. Just that leaf. I'm going to show you one more thing here, then we'll call it a day on this particular topic. Go back to the sphere material. Show you one from the previous set, the ray tracer set. This one here, what's with the checkerboard? Click on that. We see this checkerboard here. Let me close this down to show you something that you won't see with any other one that I'm aware of. You take a look, there's no texture map there, no texture map here, but down here in the bottom there's an environment texture map. The environment texture map basically creates a globe that's invisible but that this ball reacts to. The ball here, the sphere basically, is inside this invisible globe and reflecting off of the globe. Click on it, look at its materials. You see that there's a huge reflection value, 90%. So this color here, these things here, are reflections that are coming off of this environment that's wrapped around it. You click on this little environment map here, you can guess what it's going to look like. Looks like that. These little checkerboards come in handy when you try to figure out where to place things on an object, where some material will fit on the object. Sometimes it's not really clear where it goes. So I've got this thing loaded up as a Photoshop file that you can use anytime you want. So I'm going to close this down now. So that's an unusual take there. Not only do you have an environment here, but we also showed you the shine texture map. A couple of things that you don't normally work with, but if you get a chance to look at them, then you get a sense of how they work. So that's how you work with materials presets here inside Photoshop.